All right, this week we are going to finish up our Plant Phys primer. So this is part 2. And last week, this figure was kind of the basis of what I was talking about. And yeah, so this represents a trade-off in plants that is really vital to understanding where plants can live and why. And if you remember, this figure shows the relationship between stomatal conductance to water vapor, which basically tells us how fast water is leaving a leaf, against the photosynthetic rate. So stomatal conductance to water vapor on the X, photosynthetic rate on the Y, and there's this really tight correlation. So if a plant is not using lots of water, it can't photosynthesize fast. Or another way to say it is, if a plant is photosynthesizing fast, it has to be using lots of water. And this is a relationship that occurs within plants. So as a plant would go from a time where there's lots of water to a drier time of year, this relationship would exist. It also exists across plants. So plants that photosynthesize faster than another plant under even ideal conditions would also be using more water. Like everything in ecology, there's exceptions to this rule, but it's pretty hard and fast, whatever that phrase means. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little more about this trade-off, why it occurs, and some other kind of mechanisms and processes related to this trade-off. In order to do that, we're going to talk about how water is actually moving through the plant and why that creates some trade-offs. And so we're going to be talking about like what actually causes the water to move, as well as what cells are being used within the plant. So let's first talk about the movement of water. So the movement of water, in order to understand that within the plant, we have to go back a little bit to basic chemistry and physical chemistry, and think about water potential. So water potential is a measure of the potential energy of water relative to pure water at some reference condition. So you've probably seen in other classes a diagram that looks something like this. So this can help us understand kind of the potential energy of water. So in this upper tube here, this U-shaped tube, we have pure water. And this little dotted line here represents a semi-permeable membrane. And in this case, it just represents a membrane where water can move through, but nothing else can. So the potential energy of water then represents like the energy or the potential for water to do work. That's what potential energy measures. And anything that, and what we're gonna be interested in for this class is anything that reduces the potential for that water to do work. So anything that reduces that energy. So the first thing that can reduce that energy is adding solutes to water. Okay, so water molecules are moving around inside the liquid, and if we add some solutes, they're binding to those water molecules and reducing their movement, or the movement of those water molecules, and that reduces the potential energy of the water relative to pure water. And so what you see happening here is, if we look at this bottom left one, the water, so we added solutes to the right side of this U-shaped tube, that reduced the potential energy of water. Now, in physics, we know in chemistry, things move from places of high concentration to low concentration, or places of high energy to low energy. And so since adding solutes on the right side reduced the energy, the water moved from a place of high energy to low energy. And so that's why we have the water being at a higher level on the right side of that tube. The other thing, we're going to skip this middle one for now because it doesn't really apply to plants, or it rarely applies to plants. But if we jump over on the left side here, we can see another reason why why the potential energy of water can change. So this time on the left side of this tube, we've applied a vacuum or negative pressure, or we could think of it like tension on the water. So all of these molecules in the water are kind of adhering to each other. And so if we pull on some of those water molecules, it pulls on the other ones and it reduces the potential energy. And so what happened here is when we put a negative pressure on the left side, water moves from the right to the left. All right, so anytime we reduce the potential energy, water is going to move in that direction. So this helps us understand the movement of water in plants. So just a few things to know about. Oops, I see my font didn't get changed, so I'm going to change this real quick. Okay, so let's get rid of that. All right, so within a plant and soil, water potential is typically between 0 and -10 megapascals, with -10 representing very dry, very stressful conditions. Now, I want to go back to these negative numbers real quick, or not go back to, but talk about these negative numbers. If we, let's go back to the definition. Water potential is the potential energy of liquid relative to pure water. So by definition, pure water is 0. It has a potential energy of 0, okay? So if we are decreasing the potential energy relative to pure water by adding solutes, that's going to be negative. It's going to have negative values, all right? And if we, so that would be this first example. If we reduce the potential energy by putting a negative pressure on it, that would also make it negative. If, on the other hand, you were to add positive pressure onto some water, that would make it greater than 0. And that's what rarely happens in plants. So we are going to be dealing with negative numbers between 0 and -10. And -10 is pretty rare, but it definitely does happen. The thing you need to remember, the more negative the value, the more stressed a plant is. Also, the more negative it is, the less energy that water has. And then lastly, water potential is represented by the Greek symbol psi. And some people remember this by the trident of Poseidon is in the shape of a psi, and Poseidon was the god of water, and so, or god of the ocean, I don't remember. Anyway, it's a psi. Okay, so now we know a little bit about water potential and the potential energy of water. And we also know that water is going to move from a place of high potential energy to low potential energy. So now we can apply this to what's going on in a plant. So this, I've got here some water potential values of different components of the plant and the ecosystem. So let's just look at these numbers real quick, and then I'll talk about kind of what their relevance is. So if we start down in the soil, and these values I'm giving you are kind of a fairly typical well-watered day for a tree. So water potential in the soil might be -0.1 megapascal. So that's pretty close to 0. The root might be -0.5, the stem could be -0.6, the branch might be 0.8, -0.8. But then the atmosphere, you'll see there's a huge jump from what's going on inside the plant to what's in the atmosphere. And so the main point of this is that the atmosphere, unless it's absolutely drenched and raining, the atmosphere is pretty darn dry compared to plant tissue. So anytime the plant is going to be exposed to sunlight and air that's less than 100% humidity, there's going to be this relatively dry air with a really negative water potential. And we know now that water potential is moving from a place of high values to low values, or high potential energy to low potential energy. And since the atmospheric air is so dry and the potential energy is so low, it's going to be, if you want to give it some action, it's going to be pulling water out of the plant very hard. It's a really strong force. And this is actually what creates the driving force of transpiration. it's this initially this dry atmosphere that's pulling water or trying to pull water out of the leaf that generates the movement of water through the entire plant. So what happens, let's say a plant has its stomates open because it wants to photosynthesize, and we know there's liquid water in the leaf that's going to convert to vapor and diffuse out through that stomate. Well, this dry atmospheric air is going to pull that water out of the stomate. Because that leaf is losing water, its water potential is also going to decrease. And so then water from the branch is going to move up into the leaf, and then that water potential is a little more negative. And that continues on down through the entire plant till we generate this water potential gradient. And so what we have then is we're going to end up with water. Look at this, fancy, huh? Water's moving up through the soil, into the roots, up through the branches to the leaves along this water potential gradient, and then at some point it's going to diffuse out into the atmosphere down this water potential gradient. All right, so fancy drawing. I realized my daughter had a drawing tablet. She's into art, and so I thought I would try to use this, but let's see if I can make this better. I'm going to have to work on my drawing skills. This is good for me though, because I love to draw on the dry erase board, and I've been missing that. So now I get to draw for you all. The reason I drew this too is because this arrow up through the plant that's all continuous represents the water in the plant, and we refer to it as a water column. Because all of those water molecules are attached to each other, it creates this continuum of water from the soil to the atmosphere, and we refer to that as the soil plant atmosphere continuum, which is listed at the top here, or SPAC. All right, so you're going to need to know this acronym, what it means, and then you need to be able to understand and be able to describe the driving gradient for water movement through the plant. Okay, let's now just do a summary slide. So this is just kind of going over the steps I talked about. I guess I won't actually talk about them. I just said them, but they're here in writing for you if you want. One thing I do want to show you though is kind of what is happening to water potential along this SPAC or this continuum over the course of a season. And so what I'm showing you here is this is from single leaf, Juniperus monosperma, like from, oh gosh, I guess it doesn't really matter where it's from. So a dry area. And in this figure, I want you to focus on these two lines. This one has closed symbols, and this line has open symbols. And so the closed symbols represent soil water potential. And these open symbols represent leaf water potential. Okay, that's not exactly what they are, but that's what they represent. What I'll show you are there's a couple things. That here on the far left is in spring when there's quite a bit of soil moisture, right? So it's fairly happy in this time. So we can see that the leaf water potential is more negative than the soil water potential, which makes sense. That's our driving gradient. So the leaves have to have a more negative value to pull that water up through the plant. The other thing you'll notice though, if we follow the closed line, it stays at about -1 for a couple months, and then it gets really, really negative. So this is as the soils are drying out, water potential in the soil gets more and more negative. That's important because leaf water potential also has to get more negative in order to extract water from the soil. And so we can see a plummet in soil water potential. We also see leaf water plummeting, leaf water potential plummeting, so that it's still more negative than soil water potential. All right, so that's kind of what's happening over the course of a year for a plant as they're dealing with these changes in water potential in the soil, and they have to adjust their leaf water potential as well so they can keep extracting water from the soil. And we've talked about two ways that plants can adjust, or that water potential can be adjusted, either solutes or the tension on the water column. they can adjust the tension on the water column by opening and closing their stomates, and they can adjust the solutes by adding sugars to the water or taking sugars out. Okay, so that's all I'm going to say for the SPAC. Nope, that's not all I'm going to say. I've got 2 more slides I want to talk about. Okay, so the water potential, let's talk about this water potential getting really negative. So in this graph, I showed you when the soil water potential was getting dry, leaf water potential was also kind of plummeting. This is kind of like this danger zone for plants, and this is when those leaf water potentials start to plummet. That represents like some stressful conditions for plants. And the reason why is because of the cells, especially those cells in the leaves, and how they maintain their function and structure. So these 2 pictures represent plant cells in the leaves, or in the leaves of plants. And so in this first example, well, let me just orient you. This kind of lightish green structure on the outside is a cell wall, which is a little bit stiff, but it can't provide structure. It's not like wood, where it can actually hold the tree up. It's a little bit stiff, but it needs the water inside it in order to maintain the structure. So leaves that hold themselves horizontal to capture the sunlight, all of those cells in there are full of water so that they give it some structure. And in that condition, when it's full of water, it's a turgid cell, or it has high turgor pressure. Turgor pressure is the pressure of the water out onto the cell wall. So if you were to take a water balloon and fill it up with water so that it gets bigger and bigger, and it gets really, the skin of the balloon is really tight, there's a lot of turgor pressure. There's a lot of water pushing out on the cell walls or the balloon walls. All right? But if we let all of that water out, that water balloon becomes like limp or wilty, like a leaf might get wilty. And that's because there's no more water pushing out on the walls of that balloon. The same thing can happen in cells. And so this, the example on the right is a cell that has lost too much water. So the water potential has gotten too negative. It's lost too much water, and it's starting to collapse on itself. When that happens, the leaves start to wilt, the photosynthetic rates of plants start to collapse and go to 0. And so that's a really bad thing for plants. And this condition, again, happens when water potentials are really, really negative. All right, so that's why, like this, as soils dry out and water potentials get negative, that's kind of hits this danger zone for plants. Okay, so that's a little bit about water potential and that driving gradient for water through the plants, and some danger that can occur in the leaves and the cells of leaves in the plants. And so next we're going to talk a little more about the pathway of water transport.